Welcome to another episode of Legal for Tech, the podcast. So, guys, you do recognize my voice here. It's always Rosie. And as I've said many times, this is just for students and young professionals who are very interested in anything that has to do with technology. And yes, it's regulation. And today I'm joined by my friend and colleague and great video streamer, Giacomo Di Gregorio. Hi, Giacomo. Great to see you.
This is an insult to the real video streamer, but thank
No,
you, Rosie. It's great. It's great to see you.
you saved us for 97 episodes, so I can frankly say that you have mastered the art. Because you joined me today, because we are actually about something that is a tiny bit different from the idea of regulation. It's more about what happens if regulation goes wrong, or if it doesn't happen at all, maybe. So we are here joined today from I'm not sure where you're calling from, Daniel. We're joined by Daniel Mügge. Hello, great to see you and welcome on the Legal for Tech, the podcast.
Hey, Rosie. Hey, Giacomo.
Um, so, um, as we started saying, you are here to talk about something that many people kind of decide not to look at or to ignore because it's a great truth that sometimes leaves us a bit uncomfortable, I would say. You recently published a book, which you will be talking about on this podcast. But first, tell our listeners, well, what's brought you to this particular career? And yes, why you're here today, aside from, well, my short introduction.
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, thanks so much for having me, for inviting me to this podcast. It's really great to talk about the book, but also about the broader issues about artificial intelligence and politics, which is right now the core of the things that I work on. Rosie, you just asked how I came to this, and I'm a political at the University of Amsterdam, and I started out working on issues of finance. That was like the politics of finance. And then I felt that I needed to move on to something different because that started to be a little bit boring. I worked about the politics of economic statistics, again, the political underbelly of something that sounds really technical, but actually is not. And then I started noticing that whenever I read something, so this was maybe a little less than 10 years ago, when I read something in the newspaper that had to do with AI in some shape or form, that sort of gave me the goosebumps, that I was like, whoa, like something is happening here. And, the statistics stuff that I was doing, that was interesting. But this AI stuff that I was reading about, that really felt like, I felt sort of like my pressure on my chest and thinking like, oh, whoa, this could be something big. And as an academic, it's really important that I work on topics that give me sort of like intrinsic motivation, where I feel like I actually want to work on this, not just to churn out the next journal article or something, but really to do it because I feel fire about this topic from the inside. And the political side of AI was exactly that. So that's what I've been doing for a while now. And I lead a research team here at the University of Amsterdam of maybe half a dozen researchers. And together we look mostly at the politics of how the EU regulates and governs artificial intelligence, and in particular how that fits into, say, the global context where there are extremely high economic stakes attached to what happens in the field of AI, but where also the geopolitical stakes of everything that has to do with AI have really gone up.
Is your group collaborating with European institutions or with like other types of organizations, or are you working on your own? Are you carrying on your project kind of independently? How does that work dynamic work?
I think there's a bit of both here. So we're based in Amsterdam, and luckily that means that we're relatively close to Brussels. And some of our team members also have previous working experience in the European institutions in Brussels. And so there's a lot of exchange that we have. There's a lot of also like literal going back and forth. When you study what happens in Brussels, it's obviously useful not just to read documents or newspapers or something, but actually to be able to go there, to talk to people who work at the European Commission and the European Parliament, but also to lobbyists and civil society organizations. So we've been doing a lot of that. That doesn't necessarily amount to a formal collaboration of sorts. So in that sense, we really are an independent academic research team, but both because we care very much about, and I think that's true for all of us, for the whole team, because we care very much about public policy, what happens in the real world, and also because such an important source of information for us, there is a lot of exchange between us here in Amsterdam and all the things that happen in Brussels, but also say in The Hague as the Dutch capital.
As Rosie has said at the beginning, we invited you also because you recently published the book. If I'm not wrong, it's called The AI Matrix: Profits, Power, Politics. Uh, could you tell us how did you arrive at the point of deciding to write this book? There something that triggered you to write it?
So this is something that I've done together with two colleagues of mine, Regine Powell, who is based in Cologne, and Vali Stan, who. And the basic impetus was that we felt that there was something wrong with the public debate about AI. And we're political economists, all three of us, means that for us, things that have to do with politics also always have an economic dimension because money plays a big role in politics, and vice versa. That certainly anything that you read about in the economics section or economy section of the newspaper has a very strong, very clear political dimension to it. For us, these are two sides of the same coin. Now, a lot of the public conversation about AI seemed to talk about it as if this was a purely economic affair. So we can boost economic growth by using more AI, or this is what AI does to the labor market. But somehow it completely blotted out the political dimension of all of this. And both the political consequences, for example, say, what happens if AI indeed increases inequality? What is that going to do to our politics, to our democracies, to whether people feel included and part of society? But also about the political decisions that shape how and where AI is developed and used. That's about public investment. Rosie, you already mentioned things like regulation. So for us, these things, we wanted to talk about them and write about them in an integrated fashion. So a political economy story about and of AI. We felt that that was missing. Started out thinking about writing an article about this, and it turned into a book.
I find the title of your book fascinating, The AI Matrix. And the reason is I actually was talking to a friend of mine who studied on the scientific side. So she studied biotechnology or something, and she's learning how to code in AI, and she's learning all of that. And she told me, really, the only thing you have to know in AI is matrices.
Yes.
And that was the scariest thing to me because I still remember learning them in school and thinking, I understand absolutely nothing of this. So it's very interesting that you chose that as a title because it is the only thing that matters in the end when it comes to AI. And you found the word that matters both to us and to potentially AI engineers and the more scientific side, who sometimes are seen as kind of like away from reality and from society. So maybe you call them in. Maybe they will be interested in this book. I'm sure. That said, I wanted to kind of understand. Matrices, as I said, are very difficult to solve. Some of them are also not possible to solve. Did you find a solution to your matrix, a kind of intersection that actually works with all of its functions, or are we still not there?
Good question. So I think the way in which we think about this AI matrix is, first of all, that AI as a set of technologies, and it's maybe something we can talk about a little bit more in a little bit, that it's actually not one AI, but there's like many different AIs, and that already is responsible, I think, for a lot of confusion. But that these AI technologies in the plural, so the different ones that are out there, that they're embedded, as it were, that they're surrounded by other facets of technological life, social life, political life, economic life. So it's like, it's, sort of like in a crossword puzzle, there are different things that surround this technology. The way that our political systems are organized, the way that our economies are organized, where a country stands in the global hierarchy of countries, whether you're part of a rich country or part of a poor country, all these sorts of things. So it's not as if AI somehow is separated out. It's an isolated thing that happens over there in that corner, and then there's politics over there. No, in the real world, like out there in the wild, what we get is a mesh of all these things. You get sort of like a big digital politics soup in which all these ingredients are already in there mixed up. The economic side, the knowledge base, the geopolitics, the societal conditions, all that sort of stuff is already in there when we encounter AI. So you never come across AI in isolation. Now, you asked whether we have solved that matrix. I think from that perspective, like there's two important messages that we have. That first of all, that when we think about and discuss things that have to do with AI, like we shouldn't make it too simple and think about it only as a technological solution to things. We shouldn't think about it only as an economic thing, but for better or worse, it is always this mash of all these different things. So we're trying to argue against simplistic narratives that say AI is only good, or it's only bad, or it's only this, or only that. Like it or not, it's a complex thing. The other thing is that what makes the AI matrix impossible to solve, to stay within that image, is that an important part of the AI matrix is what we think about AI. So there has been a lot of talk recently about whether there is an AI bubble out there, whether too much money has been invested in AI, and that large companies like OpenAI, Meta, Google, Amazon, Oracle, what have you not, that they're pouring too much money in it. But that investment itself is driven by expectations that people now have about the AI future. So it's like our thinking about the future has a real world and a big real world impact about what happens here and now. So in that sense, it's not like we could take a snapshot of what's happening now and then we could understand it and put together all the pieces of the puzzle. What people think may be going on in the future with these technologies shapes what happens now already. And this weird feedback loop, the pulling into the present of a potential future, that makes it really complicated to say, oh, this is what it is, this is what's going on. Because once we think we know what's going on, we, by knowing and by making a claim, this is what it is, itself shape the future because we incentivize people to invest, we disincentivize them to invest, we incentivize them to regulate. We say, oh, you don't need to regulate because this is a harmless technology, whatever.
I think, if I'm not wrong, in your book, you emphasize a lot the US-China competition in dominating the AI economy. How does the geopolitical dimension, you think, that play out for countries that are outside of this binomy, like, for example, for the EU, in which we live, or also for the global South, out of this image, let's say?
Yeah. So I think, Giacomo, as you say, like for us, it's important to appreciate how this whole AI question is embedded in this bipolar geopolitical competition between the United States and China, what some people have called an AI race, in a way. And I think, if I may, I think there are different steps to answering your question here. And the first one is that this was initially said that the United States dominated, as was true in the digital space in general. China has made great strides over the past decades in catching up to the point where in the United States, at some point, political and technology leaders felt threatened by China, that it was catching up, that it might overtake them. The United States tried different strategies to sort of like slam the brakes on Chinese technology development, forbidding them to buy NVIDIA chips, forcing other countries not to export their technologies to China. The Dutch company ASML, for example, that makes important chip manufacturing technology. Now it seems to be the case that, at least it's my reading, that in the most recent national security strategy of the United States that was published in late 2025, there seems to be a little bit of a recognition that China is an extremely powerful country, that the United States will not completely outcompete China. And there's more an accommodation of that there may be a handful of global powers, and the United States and China may be the two most important ones, that within their own spheres of influence may coexist in a way. So I think, like, if there's any part of good news about American, geopolitical politics, I think it's that recognition that maybe, they'll have to get used to the idea that they exist next to each other, that's not one dominating the other, and I appreciate that because that strikes me as true. Now, that gets to your question, where does that leave Europe and the rest of the world? I think there are two different stories to be told here. The first thing is, when it comes to digital technologies, definitely is a second tier power. So it's like one step below what's happening in the United States and in China. It's not at the same level, and anybody in Brussels who thinks that it is, I think that's wrong. That's not because we don't have great technology companies in Europe, but it is for two other reasons. The first one is that only American and Chinese technology companies have managed, as it were, to, if you will, colonize other areas of the global economy. Europe runs on American tech. Microsoft is everywhere. Google is everywhere. We use American computer chips. All these things are American, right? Like that is like we're in digital terms, we're an add-on to the American digital empire. That's true in other places in the world for Chinese tech, where countries basically run on Chinese hardware, on Chinese software. They use Chinese mobile phones, what have you not. That is an enormous source of power for these countries because we depend, in our case here in Europe, on the United States for the digital infrastructures that we use every day. And Europe does not have that position, right? So we have our own tech, but it's not like we dominate the technology landscape anywhere else. We don't do that. Only the United States and China do that. What that means, however, is that for Europe, the question right now is, can we achieve some kind of digital sovereignty, digital independence, digital autonomy, however you want to call it, where we say, okay, we're not trying to rule anybody else digitally, but we do want to have control within our own borders of what happens in digital payments, in data storage, in the AI models we use, in hardware manufacturing, all this sort of stuff. Now, if you compare that to what you call the Global South, Giacomo, many other countries on the planet, they don't even have that option. So for Europe, there may be something that you could think of as passive sovereignty. So we're not ruling anybody else, but at least we can control our own affairs. If you're a country in sub-Saharan Africa or another small country elsewhere in the Global South, you will have to work either with Chinese or American technology for the time being. The option of saying we make what we use completely ourselves is not on the cards at all. So I think the overall dynamic to see to go back to your original question is that the more societies in general depend on digital technologies as sort of like the basic infrastructures of how they organize themselves, they're liable to buy either into the American tech stack or the Chinese tech stack and become like parts. That's what I meant with that part of sort of like larger digital empires where they're plugged in to these digital networks that are centered either on China or the US.
That's a very interesting answer. I was wondering whilst listening, you don't know, potentially you've already you're on top of the news on this, but France has I think a week ago rolled out the use of any American software that kind of connects government officials. And I read the news on Le Monde, and it was pas plus, which in French means like
Yes.
really not. Like that's
No
it.
more.
No more. And I was wondering, do you think that the French narrative, because I've noticed that you said something along the lines of like, yeah, we are not at the level of the US or China. And if someone in Brussels thinks so, well, they are mistaken. How about if someone in Paris thinks so? Do you think that they are overshooting? Do you think that following this trajectory, so the Macron for sure trajectory, I'm going to put it that way, is an option for us? And is this a solution to our matrix, the starting point of this conversation?
So what I do think is that it's important to be ambitious. That is something that I very much appreciate. So in that sense, we shouldn't be unrealistic about these things, but I think it is fair to be daring in our ambition to become relatively more independent, to gain a degree of sovereignty in this domain. I think what's important to understand here is one other thing. A lot of the comparisons that we see between the United States and China and Europe are, I think, using metrics that are not the ones that we should care about. Let me make this concrete. In the European context, the so-called Draghi report made a big splash. So this was a report that the European Commission had commissioned that basically asked Mario Draghi, previous president of the European Central Bank and also Italian president or prime minister, to lay out a vision for the future, what sort of like the major economic challenges are for the European Union. And in there, you find a lot of graphs that compare economically the United States, China, and Europe, and that find that, for example, economic growth is a lot higher in China and the United States than in Europe. And in particular, that in the digital domain, these two countries are far ahead, say, for example, in the amount of investment, in the amount of money that's being poured into data centers, computer chips, these sorts of things. On that level, Europe can't compete, and for the foreseeable future, it won't compete. The question is, should we want to? Because I personally think that in many respects, these kinds of technologies are being developed and deployed in ways that do not make average citizens better off. Quite often, I think they're used in ways that are potentially harmful, that are frequently useless, that concentrate wealth in the hands of the few. So in some ways, it may actually be perfectly fine if we're not following the path of the United States or China, because I think the political, societal, and economic consequences often are negative. So what I would much rather want to see is get away from the idea of competing with these two countries, but make up your own mind about where you feel that these digital technologies benefit your own societies, and then have a public push in order to see that we somehow get our act together and do that. And in the other domains where we feel that maybe it's actually not a good idea to have these technologies, we don't need those data centers, right? So let me give you a very concrete example. You mentioned France. Another thing happening in France is I think that they've maybe have already done so or planned, but I think they have already done so to follow the Australian example of banning social media for young people under the age of 16. Now, if you put social media and everything that happens there next to, for example, the massive investments of a company like Meta, which, among other things, owns Facebook. No people under 16 use Facebook, but for the sake of the argument, and Instagram and the like, a lot of the AI investment that Meta does is in order to improve its advertising algorithms towards the people who use its platforms. To me personally, that is money spent that does not make a society better off, right? Meta is an advertising company. It uses its resources. It uses its AI investment to make, among other things, young people buy stuff that they otherwise wouldn't buy and that they frequently actually don't have the money for. So if we say we think that these kinds of social media users are harmful for young people, and therefore we don't need these data centers that are used elsewhere to hook young people onto social media and make them buy stuff that's not good for them. If we don't have that same data center, that's good for Europe, not bad, right? And so there's quite a few use cases where you say, I can understand that somebody can earn money with this. Does it make society better off? No. So let's be much more judicious about where we want this or not and craft our own digital future, not just run after what the Chinese or Americans do.
I think this is a great point. Let's try and understand what's useful to us, what's useful to society. And you mentioned the social media world, which I would say arguably in the last 2-3 years has become quite clear as not being something that necessarily protects people or helps people, especially when we come to children. And yes, France is going in that direction. Spain apparently has already passed a law. So we'll see what's happening in that regard. There is one technology, however, that I feel is particularly eye-opening when it comes to this question, is that useful to us? And I would argue that that's AI. And what type of AI? I will tell you, generative AI. It's not clear whether it's helping. It's not clear whether it actually boosts productivity. It's not clear what kind of productivity it boosts. And ultimately, it's not clear whether, especially at work, the workers, the employees that use artificial intelligence in the form of generative AI. So we're talking LLMs, we're talking LVMs, potentially we're talking brain foundation models, something I found out about today, I was shocked about. We're not sure whether these workers are actually receiving a boost or a very short-term gain that then will turn out to be their doom. In this regard, can we actually assess from a political economy point of view, can we actually assess whether this could be useful to Europe? Do we actually need this? Because the AI race has become tomorrow's geopolitical strategic problem, and that's the race between China and the US, and Europe feels left behind. Is Europe being protected from a future that's bringing to nowhere?
That's a super difficult question to answer with confidence, of course. I think what we can do is like we can call already, and you did so just now, the bluff on some of the exaggerated expectations that people had, right? So there is a lot of research by now that says, that companies who try to implement certain kinds of AI strategies, that they struggle to make anything useful out of it. Pilot projects, many of them are being started but are being abandoned because nobody knows what this is actually good for. A lot of AI adoption is extremely shallow. So yes, somebody uses ChatGPT or Copilot to write an extra email or something, but that's not exactly like a world transforming technology or something. So in that sense, I think there is the tempering the expectations about what's coming out of this is, I think, the first step. The other thing is that I feel what's frequently ignored are the experiences of the people who actually use this stuff in their daily work. So if we think about, in general, how we interact with digital technologies in our workplaces, we have experiences. Some things really work very well for us. And I mean, for you, Rosie, for you, Giacomo, and for myself, some technologies work really great and others are extremely frustrating to use, where we constantly have to work around them. There's way too many QR codes or extra verification systems, or you somehow have to try to game the system to get something done, or, feel that it's really just pointless. My impression is also that many of the people, say, who work with these technologies in education, in hospitals, in police forces, and what have you not, there's a lot of real world information out there about what actually genuinely helps people do their job better, or what has been dreamt up at some consultancy somewhere, and then it's like top down being implemented at an organization, because finally that is sold as the magical solution to implement cost savings of God knows how many millions of euros, right? So I think there's this weird disconnect between a public narrative about how great all this stuff could be, that continues to be touted typically by people who themselves have a lot of money to earn from this, consultancies, for example, tech companies and the like, and the everyday experiences that people have when you ask them just how great this technology is when they use it. I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that, at least what I feel I observe, and that goes back to your point about social media, Rosie, I already feel that there's a little bit of AI fatigue setting in some places where, people play around with some technologies for a while. And I guess that's a good thing in a way, that they're curious about stuff like, what can you do with this? But then at some point, it also becomes a little bit, yeah, I don't know. Okay, it's not that great after all. And of course, what you see is that the companies who make these technologies, that they start to monetize them. So, for example, the different ideas that OpenAI has about how it can introduce advertising into the results that, a chatbot like ChatGPT generates, the moment you start even getting the feeling that the answers that ChatGPT generates, that they're laced with conscious advertising that people have paid for, I mean, then you're like, whoa, wait a minute, right? I mean, how seriously can you take that? You ask it for good ideas where to have dinner in Paris, and the answers are paid for answers. Like when you go to Yelp, that's what's going on. But like in ChatGPT, so again, I sort of wonder whether we don't also, reach a point where, like from the everyday user experience, some stuff will stick, but others I think may also be quietly buried because people really don't find it all that useful or exciting after all.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned at the beginning, at the very beginning, that you mentioned there is a oversimplification of AI. There are different types of AI, and they could have also very different political economic effects. Do you think that this distinction matter for regulation and governance? And do you think that we should be developing different policy frameworks for different types of AI?
So I think where that definitely matters is when people talk about AI, quite frequently they're thinking indeed of different forms of generative AI, large language models, indeed ChatGPT, but also things that generate other forms of content, music, videos, images, what have you not. Um, and I think the much bigger economic potential is in, for example, applying AI in robotics or in manufacturing in different shapes or forms, upgrading the versatility, adaptability of things that happen in large factories. Certainly in countries that have high wage levels, as is true for many European countries, where the way to stay competitive in our production is to continuously upgrade our production processes. There I see a lot of potential. What that means is when it comes to how we in Europe think about where do these technologies hold potential, and again, this goes back to the point, then I think we shouldn't so much think about, oh, we need to invest in huge data centers of the scale that, say, a company like Meta builds for itself. No, we should be thinking, what do we, for example, have in Europe in terms of manufacturing companies that right now are very well established, that may face serious competition from manufacturers in other parts of the world? And how could we, for example, encourage the judicious use of AI in these kinds of companies to boost, upgrade the manufacturing capabilities that we have here? Right. So this goes back to the question of where the public imagination is, because I think that's also true for policymakers. Again, like many people, they hear AI and they think like, oh, Meta, data centers. I'm thinking, no, think of a company, I don't know whether it's Siemens, for example, or Alstom or somebody like that, Volkswagen, what have you not. They don't have data centers, the size of a five-story warehouse or something. No, they have something maybe the size of a garage that they have on site within their factory. The data is not scraped from all the internet, screwing everybody's copyright. No, it's data that's generated within the own factory. That's what they use to improve their manufacturing process. Completely different idea. And so supporting something like that, I think makes much more sense than just saying we need to copy what the others do. So in that sense, I think differentiating between these different kinds, what is actually useful, what's also economically useful, is super important.
Daniel, I would continue this conversation forever if it were for me, but I have to ask you the last question, which will be twofold. The first part is, if our listeners were to tune in right now, what kind of takeaway would you give them from the book that you have co-authored, as you said, and is available open source? We will put the link in the show notes. And then the second question is there anything else that you think our listeners could read, experience, listen to that would kind of complement the type of knowledge that you've put in the book, or that would complement their knowledge about the world of today, the geopolitical issues that we are experiencing, and the future of our society from a geopolitical point of view?
For me personally, the core message of the book is that AI is political, that it's about political choices that we make. It's about politically colored narratives. This is a power game. AI is are a set of technologies that increase the power in the hands of the powerful, and whether these are governments that can use AI for surveillance purposes, or whether these are companies that can suck in, as is true, for example, for big tech companies that can suck in profits that are generated elsewhere in the companies and in the economies. And what we see is that stock markets rise, but effectively it's only these big tech companies that explode in value, and everybody else sort of like flatlines. So it's a power concentration machine in many ways. That's how these technologies are used, and I think appreciating that and understanding how that works in the complex world that we live in gives a very different perspective and a much more nuanced perspective on AI technologies than is the case, if you just follow, say, the kinds of posts that you come across on LinkedIn or something. When it comes to the broader question that you ask, where else to turn? Here's sort of like a sideways answer to that question. In more general terms, I feel that we have embraced digital technologies a little bit too quickly and a little bit too enthusiastically. I think there has been a fascination with everything that's digital is new, is innovative, is the future, so we have to just embrace and go there. I'm a big fan of something that you could call analog resistance. And what I mean by that is, that I think there's something important to be won by being willing to say no to digital offerings. And I think we're too caught up in this idea that the digital is the future. And so whether we like it or not, we just have to accept it. And if you don't, then you're just left behind. So just recently, I bought for myself, let me show you this here. It's like I bought an on-paper agenda again, and I stopped using my Google Calendar right here. And so I'm back to something where, I write things down. I find this a very therapeutic almost thing to do. And so rather than, saying, okay, like here are additional kinds of, news sources, information sources, I would rather encourage people to take a long walk, with open eyes, go through the city, feel the walls of the buildings that you come along, talk to a stranger, because I think it's that human contact, that human essence that we really risk losing as we're more and more in these digital channels. So by all means, of course, keep listening to this podcast. By all means, also feel free to read the book. But at the same time, if you want another source of input that makes me reappreciate what the right balance is between digital and non-digital, go outside, get some fresh air, talk to people, and I think that does a lot of good.
And our listeners should know that they can always contact us to have a conversation with the Legal for Tech team. We're always there to listen to any complaints and potentially also praises. So anyways, thank you so much, Daniel. That was a great kind of bringing us back to the origins and potentially solving the matrix by bringing us back to humanity. Who knows? Maybe that's a solution that we need. I think matrices are the least human thing you can find on the face of the earth.
They're pretty tough, yeah.
That's what we need. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to meet you, and we really hope to read something from you in the future again.
All right. Thanks so much, Giacomo. Thanks so much, Rosie. See you soon.
Thank you.
This was all from the Legal for Tech, the podcast.
This episode was brought to you in partnership with DigiBeetle. DigiBeetle helps privacy professionals to stay up to date with the most important European documents in the AI, data and digital space every day. Curious to know more? Check out the link in our show notes.